It all started with a gut feeling, something I couldn't quite put into words. My wife, Sarah, had been acting distant for months. At first, I brushed it off, thinking it was just stress from her job or maybe the usual ups and downs of a long-term marriage. We'd been together for 15 years after all. We had 2 kids, a house in the suburbs, and what I thought was a solid foundation. But looking back, the signs were there. I just didn't want to see them. It didn't help that my best friend, Mike, was always around. Mike and I had been friends since college. We'd been through everything together. Breakups, career changes, even the birth of my kids. He was the guy I trusted more than anyone, the one I'd call at 2 a.m. if I needed help. So when he started showing up at our house more often, I didn't think much of it. He'd always been a part of our lives. But then things started to feel off. Sarah would light up when Mike walked into the room in a way she hadn't with me in years. They'd laugh at inside jokes I didn't understand, and she'd spend hours texting someone while I was right there next to her on the couch. When I asked her about it, she'd just shrug and say, "It's nothing. Just work stuff." Work stuff. Right. The breaking point came one rainy Tuesday night. Sarah had gone out for a girls' night, or so she said. I was home with the kids, helping my son Alex with his homework when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Mike. "Hey man, you free to grab a drink later?" I stared at the message, confused. Mike knew I was home with the kids. He knew Sarah was out. Why would he ask me to grab a drink? Something about it didn't sit right with me. That's when I did something I'd never done before. I checked Sarah's iPad. We shared an iCloud account, so her messages synced to it. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I'd look for 2 seconds, see nothing, and feel like an idiot. But the moment I opened her messages, my stomach dropped. There it was. Page after page of texts between Sarah and Mike. Flirty jokes, heart emojis, and plans to meet up when I wasn't around. My hands shook as I scrolled through them, my heart pounding in my chest. The worst part? They'd been doing this for months, right under my nose. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. My wife, my best friend, the 2 people I trusted most in the world had been lying to me for who knows how long. I wanted to scream, to break something, to confront them right then and there. But I couldn't. Not with Alex in the next room, oblivious to the bomb that had just gone off in our family. I waited until Sarah got home that night, my mind racing the entire time. When she walked through the door, all smiles and smelling like wine, I couldn't even look at her. "We need to talk," I said, my voice tight. She froze, her smile fading. "What's wrong?" I handed her the iPad, open to the messages. Her face went pale as she realized what she was looking at. For a moment, she didn't say anything. Then she started crying. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice shaking. "It just happened. I didn't mean for it to go this far." "Didn't mean for it to go this far?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You've been lying to me for months, Sarah, with Mike, my best friend. How could you do this to me, to us?" She tried to explain, to justify it, but I wasn't listening. All I could think about was how stupid I'd been, how blind I'd been to what was happening right in front of me. I felt like a fool. The next day, I confronted Mike. I showed up at his apartment unannounced, the messages printed out and shoved in my pocket. When he opened the door, he looked surprised to see me. "Hey man, what's up?" he asked, his tone casual, like nothing was wrong. I didn't say a word. I just handed him the papers. His face fell as he realized what they were. "Look, I can explain," he started, but I cut him off. "Explain what? How you've been screwing my wife behind my back? How you've been lying to me for months? What kind of friend does that, Mike? What kind of person?" He didn't have an answer. He just stood there looking guilty and ashamed, and that was enough for me. I turned around and walked out, slamming the door behind me. The days that followed were a blur. Sarah moved out, staying with her sister while we figured out what to do next. Mike tried to apologize, to explain that it wasn't what it looked like, but I wasn't having it. I blocked his number and cut him out of my life completely. The hardest part was telling the kids. Alex, who was 12, took it the hardest. He idolized Mike, saw him as an uncle, and the betrayal hit him just as hard as it hit me. My daughter Lily, who was 16, was harder to read. She didn't say much, just listened quietly as I explained that Mommy and Daddy were going to live apart for a while. What I didn't expect was Lily's reaction a few days later. She came home from school, her face red and tear-streaked, and immediately started yelling at me. "How could you do this to Mom?" she screamed. "She told me everything. You've been controlling and neglectful, and she was lonely. Mike was there for her when you weren't." I was stunned. Sarah had spun the story to make herself the victim, and Lily had bought it hook, line, and sinker. No matter how much I tried to explain, she refused to listen. In her eyes, I was the bad guy. That was the moment I realized just how much I'd lost. My wife, my best friend, and now my daughter. The only person who seemed to understand was Alex. He didn't say much, but he stayed by my side, a quiet reminder that I wasn't completely alone. The betrayal had shattered my life, but it wasn't over yet. Little did I know, karma was already working its way into the picture, and it was about to hit Sarah and Mike harder than they ever expected. The weeks after the betrayal were some of the darkest of my life. Sarah had moved out, and the house felt empty without her. Every room reminded me of what I'd lost. The kitchen where we'd shared morning coffee, the living room where we'd watched movies as a family, the bedroom where I'd slept next to her for 15 years. It was like living in a museum of a life that no longer existed. The hardest part, though, was the silence. Sarah and I barely spoke, and when we did, it was only about logistics. Who would take the kids to school, how we'd split the bills, when we'd tell our families about the separation. There was no warmth, no kindness, just cold, clipped conversations that left me feeling even more alone. But the real gut punch came from Lily. My 16-year-old daughter, the little girl who used to climb into my lap and tell me I was her hero, had turned against me. She believed Sarah's version of events, that I'd been neglectful, controlling, and driven her into Mike's arms. No matter how much I tried to explain, she refused to listen. "Mom told me everything," she said one night, her arms crossed and her eyes blazing. "You were never there for her. You didn't care about her feelings. Mike actually listened to her. He made her happy." "Lily, that's not true," I said, my voice breaking. "Your mom and Mike lied to both of us. They betrayed our family. I know it's hard to hear, but I need you to trust me." She just shook her head. "I don't want to talk about this anymore. I'm staying with Mom." And just like that, she was gone. She packed a bag and left with Sarah, leaving me and Alex alone in the house. It felt like losing her all over again, and the pain was almost unbearable. But if there was one bright spot in all of this, it was Alex. My 12-year-old son had always been quiet and introspective, but in the wake of the betrayal, he surprised me with his strength and maturity. He didn't say much, but he didn't have to. His presence was enough. One night, after Lily had left, I found Alex sitting on the couch, staring at the TV, but not really watching it. I sat down next to him, unsure of what to say. "You okay, buddy?" I asked finally. He shrugged. "I just don't get it. How could Mom do that to you? How could Mike?" His words hit me like a punch to the chest. Here was this kid, barely a teenager, trying to make sense of a situation that didn't make sense to me either. "I don't know," I admitted. "Sometimes people make terrible choices, and they hurt the people who love them the most. But it's not your fault, Alex. None of this is your fault." He nodded, but I could tell he was still struggling. "Do you think Mom and Mike are going to be together now?" The question caught me off guard. I hadn't even thought about that possibility, but now that he'd said it, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The idea of Sarah and Mike being together, building a new life while I picked up the pieces of ours, made me sick to my stomach. I don't know, I said again. But it doesn't matter. What matters is that we stick together, okay? You and me. We're a team. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time in weeks, I saw a flicker of hope in his eyes. Okay, he said quietly. Team us. Those two words became our mantra in the weeks that followed. Whenever things felt too heavy, whenever the weight of everything threatened to crush us, we'd remind each other. Team us. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep us going. Meanwhile, Sarah and Mike's relationship was unraveling in ways I couldn't have predicted. From what I heard through mutual friends, their affair hadn't magically turned into some fairy tale romance. Instead, it was a mess of jealousy, guilt, and regret. Mike, it turned out, wasn't the knight in shining armor Sarah had made him out to be. He was selfish and unreliable, and he quickly grew tired of playing the role of the supportive boyfriend. He started pulling away, making excuses to avoid seeing her, and eventually, he stopped answering her calls altogether. Sarah was devastated. She'd thrown away her marriage, her family, for a man who didn't even want her. And when she tried to reach out to me, to apologize and ask for another chance, I shut her down. You made your choice, I told her over the phone, my voice cold. Now you have to live with it. But the real kicker came when Lily started to see the truth. She'd been living with Sarah, watching her mom fall apart, and it didn't take long for her to realize that the story she'd been told didn't add up. One night, she showed up at the house unannounced, her eyes red from crying. "Dad, I'm sorry," she said the moment I opened the door. "I didn't know. Mom lied to me. She made it sound like you were the bad guy, but it's not true, is it?" I pulled her into a hug, my heart breaking for her. "It's okay, Lily. You didn't know, but I'm glad you're here now." It wasn't an easy road back to trust, but it was a start. Slowly, Lily began to rebuild her relationship with me. And for the first time in months, I felt like we might actually be okay. As for Alex, he became my rock. He was the one who kept me grounded, who reminded me that even in the darkest times, there was still light. We spent hours together, playing video games, going for walks, and just talking. He was growing up before my eyes, and I was so proud of the person he was becoming. The betrayal had cost me so much, my wife, my best friend, and nearly my daughter. But it had also given me something priceless, a stronger bond with my son. And as we stood together, facing whatever came next, I knew we'd be okay. Because we were a team. The months after the betrayal were a whirlwind of emotions. Sarah and Mike's relationship, which had started with so much secrecy and passion, quickly fell apart. It turned out that Mike wasn't the perfect partner Sarah had imagined. He was selfish, unreliable, and, as I later found out, still seeing other women on the side. Sarah called me one night, her voice shaking with tears. "I made a mistake," she said, "a huge mistake. I don't know what I was thinking. Mike, he's not who I thought he was." I listened quietly, my heart torn between sympathy and anger. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to tell her it would be okay. But the other part, the part that still carried the scars of her betrayal, couldn't forget what she'd done. "I'm sorry you're hurting," I said finally. "But you made your choice, Sarah. You chose him over us, over our family, and now you have to live with that." She started crying harder, begging for another chance. But I held firm. I couldn't go back to the way things were. Too much had happened. Too much had been broken. Meanwhile, Mike was facing his own reckoning. His reputation took a hit when word of the affair got out. Mutual friends who had once admired him now saw him for what he was, a backstabber who had betrayed his best friend. He tried to reach out to me a few times, leaving voicemails and texts filled with apologies, but I ignored them all. He didn't deserve my forgiveness, and I wasn't ready to give it. The real turning point came when Lily finally saw the truth. She'd been living with Sarah, watching her mom spiral into depression as her relationship with Mike crumbled. It didn't take long for Lily to realize that the story Sarah had told her, the one where I was the villain, was a lie. One evening, Lily showed up at the house unannounced. She looked tired, her eyes red from crying, and she didn't say a word as she walked in and sat down on the couch. "Hey," I said cautiously. "Everything okay?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry, Dad. I didn't know. Mom lied to me. She made it sound like you were the bad guy, but it's not true, is it?" My heart broke for her. She was just a kid, caught in the middle of a mess she didn't understand. I sat down next to her and pulled her into a hug. "It's okay, Lily," I said softly. "You didn't know, but I'm glad you're here now." It wasn't an easy road back to trust. Lily had a lot of anger and confusion to work through, and there were times when she lashed out at me, blaming me for the family falling apart. But slowly, with patience and love, we began to rebuild our relationship. Alex, on the other hand, had become my rock. He was the one who kept me grounded, who reminded me that even in the darkest times, there was still light. We spent hours together, playing video games, going for walks, and just talking. He was growing up before my eyes, and I was so proud of the person he was becoming. One night, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Alex turned to me and said, "Dad, do you think we'll ever be a family again?" I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. The truth was, I didn't know. Sarah had hurt us deeply, and while I didn't hate her, I couldn't see a way back to the life we'd had before. "I don't know, buddy," I said finally. "But we're a family, you and me. And Lily, too. We might not look like the families in the movies, but we've got each other. And that's enough." He nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "Team us, right?" "Team us," I agreed, ruffling his hair. As the months passed, life began to settle into a new normal. Sarah and Mike's relationship officially ended, and Sarah moved into a small apartment nearby. She tried to rebuild her relationship with the kids, but it was slow going. Lily was still angry with her, and Alex, while polite, kept his distance. For me, the healing process was slow but steady. I threw myself into work and spent as much time as I could with the kids. I even started dating again, though it was strange and awkward at first. I wasn't sure if I'd ever fully trust someone again, but I was willing to try. The biggest surprise came one afternoon when I got a call from Mike. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. "Hey," he said when I picked up. His voice was hesitant, almost nervous. "I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. For everything." I was silent for a long moment, unsure of how to respond. Part of me wanted to yell at him, to tell him how much he'd hurt me. But another part, the part that had been working so hard to heal, just felt tired. "I appreciate the apology," I said finally. "But it's going to take a lot more than a phone call to fix what you broke." "I know," he said quietly. "And I don't expect you to forgive me. I needed to say it." We didn't talk long after that. There wasn't much left to say. But as I hung up the phone, I felt a strange sense of closure. Mike's apology didn't erase the pain he'd caused, but it was a step forward. In the end, the betrayal had cost me so much. My wife, my best friend, and nearly my family. But it had also given me something priceless. A stronger bond with my kids, and a newfound appreciation for the people who truly mattered. As I sat on the porch that evening, watching Alex and Lily play in the yard, I realized that we were going to be okay. We weren't the family we used to be, but we were still a family, and that was enough.